All right, so last couple of weeks, we started by looking at the pre-work stuff 2 weeks ago, and then last week we started watching some scenes from the movie Catch Me If You Can. And for those of you who weren't here or don't remember, just kind of a brief recap of where we've gotten so far. This is a story of a guy named Frank Abagnale, and he's the one in the front running there, and an FBI agent who's pursuing him because Frank Abagnale is a check kiter. He basically goes around creating fraudulent checks and cashing them. And we are looking at what we've looked at is his beginning, and really he gets started when he's very young. He's like 16 or 17 years old. When the first thing he does actually is he impersonates a teacher, plays the role of a substitute teacher at school, and gets away with it for several weeks. And we talked about sort of some of the personality traits that would help you to do that, and being sort of fearless and being able to think on your feet and being able to kind of act with authority even when you don't necessarily have any. All of those are things that we see in his character, and all of those things are going to serve him well in working to try to defraud people as well. So then we see that his parents get a divorce. One of the observations that somebody made last week was that what you see in his parents and what they are conveying to him is a very materialistic concept of the world. That he views the world through the sense of if you have stuff, if you're wealthy, if you're respected, that's what makes you a success. That's what makes you a good person. And so that lesson is something he carries with him when he runs away from home because he doesn't want to be part of the divorce, and he's forced to make a choice. Is he going to live with his mom? Is he going to live with his dad? He doesn't want to do either one of those things. He doesn't want to make the choice, I should say. So he runs away. Last week, we finished by watching a clip about it. The problem he runs into is he can't get anybody to take his checks because once he starts bouncing them, then the people that normally would take checks won't take them anymore, and he can't cash them at any of the banks or anything like that. And so he's running into a problem, which is he doesn't have any way, especially because he's only 17 years old, to really fund the kind of life that he wants to, or even to fund his ability to just be out on his own. And so last week we looked at this, and we're going to look at it again because we didn't get a chance to really talk about it. But we looked at this where he has this insight, this sort of revelation that comes to him, recognizing that there's a way maybe to use how people think about think about him to create authority for himself, basically. So I don't want to tell you too much of this. Let's just go ahead and take a look at this.
Now he wants me in Long Island to take a few clients out for a night on the town.
I'm sorry, but we're not allowed to cash checks from other banks. How would we know if they were any good?
What did you say your name was?
Ashley?
Ashley. What I found on the sidewalk out there? What's this slip right off your neck?
Something I can help you with, son.
Well, you see, it's my grandmother's birthday next week, and I want to get her something extra special. Please, I mean, it's my midterm next week, and my books were stolen. Please, it's just $5. Dora would have to know.
I'm sorry, but we are not allowed to take checks from people we don't know.
boarding costs.
What do you think, Angelo? The ladies are right this afternoon. Come here. You betcha. You be a pilot? There you go. We're already in school.
All right, so what does he observe in this clip? What does he see that makes him kind of think about it? We'll get to what he decides to do with this in a minute here, but what does he see going on there at the end that really kind of jumps out at him?
Uniform brings respect.
Okay, he sees that the uniform brings respect. That a pilot is a respected person, particularly in this period of time. Today, maybe not quite as much, although still I think to a significant extent, but during this period of time, lots of people wanted to be pilots. It was kind of a glamorous kind of a job in a lot of ways, and so he sees this, and he perceives that this brings respect with it. And his belief is that if he can have that kind of respect, then he won't have to worry about people not wanting to cash his checks or not taking him seriously, that he can basically create respect for himself without necessarily having to do it himself. So this is the idea that he comes up with. So I want to just show that as a quick introduction. We're actually going to go ahead and jump forward and take a look at how he does this, how he manages to pull off making people think he's a pilot. And some of this, there's a concept when we talk about people who are confidence artists, con artists, that they do something called social engineering. And what that is the idea that they identify the weak points in a system. People who are vulnerable, like elderly people in some cases, or aspects of the system where you can get the system to work for you if you know how to do it, and then he uses those in order to get what he wants to do. And you're going to see several different vulnerabilities here. And I want you to think about, number one, what are the weaknesses that he's preying on? And then number two, how does he take advantage of those things? And then we'll talk about that in a second here.
I have decided to become an airline pilot. I have applied to all the big airlines and I have several promising interviews lined up. How's Mom? Have you called her lately? Love, your son, Frank. Hello. I'm Frank Black from Monroe High School and I have an appointment with Mr. Morgan.
You're the young man who's writing the article for the school paper.
Yes, ma'am, that's me. I want to know everything there is to know about being a pilot. What airports does Pan Am fly to? What does a pilot make in the air, and who tells them where they're going to fly to?
Whoa, slow down, just take them one at a time.
All right. What does it mean when one pilot says to another pilot, what kind of equipment do you want?
I just want to know what kind of aircraft you're flying. Is it a DC-8, 707, Constellation?
And what about those ID badges that I've seen pilots wear?
Well, every pilot has to have two things with them at all times. One is their airline personnel badge, looks just like this one here from Pan Am. The other one is their FAA license. And that looks just like this.
Oh. Do you think I can make a copy of this to put in my article?
Oh, Frank, you can have that one. It's 3 years expired.
Oh, thanks. And what about your ID badge? You have an extra one I could borrow?
Oh, no, I can't help you there. It was a special order from Polaroid. The only way to get one of those is become a real live pilot for Pan American Airways.
Pan Am, may I help you?
Hello, I'm calling about a uniform.
Call for purchasing.
Thank you.
Purchasing.
I'm a co-pilot based out of San Francisco. I flew a flight into New York last night, but the problem is I'm headed out to Paris in 3 hours.
How can we help you?
I sent my uniform to be cleaned through the hotel. I guess they must have lost it.
They lost a uniform. Happens all the time. Go down to the Well-Built Uniform Company at 9th and Broadway. They are uniform supplier. I'll tell Mr. Rosen you're coming.
You look too young to be a pilot.
I'm a co-pilot.
Oh, why so nervous?
How'd you feel if you lost your uniform first week on the job?
Relax. Pan Am got lots of uniform. It's going to be $164.
Great. I'll write you a check.
Sorry, no checks, no cash. You'll have to fill in your employee ID number, and then I'll bill Pan Am. I'll take it out and need an extra paycheck.
Even better. Dear Dad, you always told me that an honest man has nothing to fear, so I'm trying my best not to be afraid. I'm sorry I ran away, but the
start by talking about some of the vulnerabilities in the system that he's able to exploit. What are some of the things that jump out at you where people are not really, they're not really making smart decisions about who they're, what they're doing and how they're doing it?
The guy he interviews, giving him all his information.
Okay, he's giving all this information, and not just all this information, what else does he give him?
ID card.
Well, not his ID card, but his expired pilot's license, basically. So he's not taking care of the information. Now, why is he able to interview that guy in the first place? Okay, it's a school article, so he uses his, you know, for one of the things he's able to do is kind of shift between looking like a teenager and looking like an adult. And so he uses the fact that he can look like a teenager to get himself this interview to actually do this article. And nobody really questions that because what?
It's believable.
It's believable. And it's not unusual for a school newspaper to want to do an article about pilots and stuff like that. So he's not telling stories that are unbelievable. He is taking advantage of what people think they would normally do. So he has them thinking in terms of that he's a high school student writing an article, and because of that, they're not really afraid about giving information, because why? Giving him information, giving him the pilot's license, why are they not afraid to do that?
He's a kid.
He's a kid. What's a high school student going to do with that kind of stuff? You know, so there's no connection being made in anybody's mind between what they're giving this person and that it might be used in some way other than what they think it is. And there again, this is a very simple version of social engineering where you are taking advantage of system vulnerabilities based around the way things normally are to do things that are abnormal. What else happens? What else is he able to do to take advantage of the system?
Well, when he gets the uniform, he's able to charge the company for the uniform.
Well, there's two things that he's able to do there. One is he's able to charge the company for the uniform, but what's the more basic thing?
You can walk straight in and get it.
Yes, he's able to go in and get a uniform, even though it doesn't work for Pan Am or anything else, simply because he speaks like a pilot and gives them the information that they need, and so they assume, because here again, why would somebody who's not a pilot try to get a pilot's uniform? You know? And so these systemic vulnerabilities at that time period at least are something that he's able to exploit in order to get himself where he needs to be or get what he needs to have. Now, we can see this kind of thing happening in our society even today. You see it happening where, you know, businesses are constantly at threat from people trying to gain access to their systems. People are constantly at threat from people trying to scam them, particularly older people, because they tend to be more vulnerable to those kinds of things. Partly because the kinds of things that we're seeing here are the kind of things that create system changes. When the system realizes that somebody can do this, then the rules start changing. Nobody shows anybody their FAA license anymore. Nobody's going to certainly give it to somebody anymore. Nobody's going. You're going to have to actually have, you know, ID card and stuff like that to get a uniform. It's made more complicated when we realize that those things have happened. But what that means is that each successive generation tends to become a little bit more savvy to some of the older forms of scams, and so newer ones have to be created. But that also means that it tends to be true that older generations are more vulnerable because they have not necessarily learned to adapt to some of those scams that some of the younger generations have. So there's elements of that going on in those kinds of things. But if you want to look at a really large-scale example of this, the September 11th attacks are this kind of thing. The terrorists who used the September 11th, or who carried out the September 11th attacks, use systemic vulnerabilities. The fact that you could come and get piloting lessons just from a private contractor in the United States without necessarily needing a lot of ID or any sort of credentials. The fact that you could get onto a plane with certain kinds of things that really could be used as weapons pretty easily, but weren't really considered weapons. The fact that, not just overwhelmingly, pretty much every incident of airline hijacking that had taken place prior to that had been for some sort of a political cause, and the purpose was not to destroy the airliner, the purpose was to get something in exchange for the hostages and the value of the plane itself. And so all of those things allowed the hijackers not only to take over the planes, but until the last plane to do it with very little resistance, because everybody assumed that if you resisted, you'd get hurt, but if you just did what you're supposed to do, then everybody would get let loose. And it wasn't until the last of the planes where they were finding out from family members that that's not what was happening, that the passengers fought back and the plane ended up crashing instead of actually hitting its intended target. So these systemic vulnerabilities are something that somebody who's clever can take advantage of. Now, I'm not just telling you this because I like talking about interesting sociological phenomena. What does this have to do with Christianity?
Well, the Bible warns us about wolves in sheep's clothing, false teachers, and also not teaching the gospel according to what the apostles taught.
Okay, so we have some very clear instructions as well as some examples in the scriptures of exactly this kind of thing taking place in the church, and of the need to be aware of that and to be mindful of it and to prevent it from happening. Jerry?
I was just thinking of your lessons on the Gnostics. That would have been the taking advantage of part truths and part untruths.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about systemic vulnerabilities in the church. Where are we weak? Where are we, maybe weak isn't the right word, where is it that people can turn what is a normal part of the church and how we interact with each other and what we listen to and those kinds of things, where can those things be used against us? Because that's the real question. If you want to defend against somebody who's trying to teach false things, if you want to defend against wolves in sheep's clothing, how do we identify the weak points so that we can shore those up? Not necessarily to get rid of them, but to recognize when there's a danger. So what are some of our weak points?
Interpretation.
Okay, so one of them, and this one is just unavoidable, is the Bible is significantly something that we interpret and we apply to a modern era when it was written in a different era. And so in making interpretations, in trying to figure out how to apply the principles of the Bible to our life today, there can definitely be some different viewpoints on what that looks like. Okay, so that's one vulnerability. What else?
Scriptures out of context that are then strung together for your
Okay, so one of the things that the scriptures can be used for is to pull bits and pieces of them out to support an idea that's really not a scriptural idea. And if you do that well enough, it can be very difficult for someone to identify what's really wrong with what you're saying, in the sense that they might know it doesn't sound right, but boy, there's a lot of scriptures there. It sure seems like that's right, you know? What else? What other vulnerabilities do we have?
Basically like unanswered prayers. Somebody sees somebody struggling that's in the church all the time and they ask, why would your God,
okay,
allow?
So we can be vulnerable to something that challenges our faith. Let's kind of broaden it a little bit further. When something isn't lining up with the way we want it to be or the way we think it should be, it becomes easy for someone to exploit that and to question the legitimacy of our faith. Okay? What else? Sarah?
I think it's all kind of circling around the same thing with unanswered prayers, scriptures out of context, whatever Jerry said. That it's, we have a perception of something and we try to make things fit. Like I've even heard this Spirit's talking to me or leading me this way. Well, Satan sounds a lot like the Holy Spirit sometimes, depending upon your perspective and what you really want to see. So sometimes, a lot of times, we don't come in with a blank slate thought process and just ask for direction. We come in wanting a specific direction and expecting a result.
Okay, so the danger there is that we put our own desires and assumptions in front of the scripture, and then we interpret everything that we see through the lens of that. And someone who plays to that can definitely take advantage of that. That's one of the reasons why prosperity theologists who teach the idea of, you send me some money and you're going to get blessings, they're so successful, is because people are looking at the scripture from the standpoint of, look at all these blessings that are out there, and I don't seem to have them, so something must be wrong, and this person's telling me an easy way to do it. So let's do that. And that tends to be very successful for certain people anyway. Ian?
And then just to your point, and when you put them in a nice shiny suit and tie in front of a really big building with a very big congregation, they wouldn't steer you wrong.
Okay, so now we're getting to this other aspect of it, which is that people play on our assumptions about what a good teacher or a good minister looks like. And if it's a successful church and they're wearing a nice suit and they're friendly and they've got, a big smile and a nice handshake and they say nice things to us, then we say, well, that looks like a minister. That's what. Now, none of those things are wrong. I mean, I don't wear a suit to church, but that's because I hate wearing ties more than anything else. But there's nothing wrong with a minister who's dressed in a suit and smiles and shakes your hand and is concerned about you and friendly and all those kinds of things. The problem is, just like with this, the pilot thing is, if we look at someone and say they look the part of the pilot, they look the part of the minister, therefore they must be reliable, they must be safe.
We also don't want to speak up when we have a concern. A lot of times we would just rather let it go. We don't want confrontation. We don't want to be the guy in the canoe making the waves, right? And so a lot of times we'll hear things we are questioned, but we won't say anything about it.
Yeah.
Because we're intimidated.
It's an intimidation.
Yeah.
People don't want that, and that's not the kind of thing you would expect at church anyway, so I'm just going to sit here.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so somebody who knows that, and this is the thing, the danger isn't somebody who comes in and has no idea about these things and start acting like this, because most of us are going to respond to that. The danger is someone who knows those things and plays to that. They know that it's intimidating when somebody's up in front and they're talking to the audience or to the congregation. They know that there's the tendency to say, oh, we don't want to cause strife or conflict. We don't want to, that didn't sound quite right to me, but I'm sure he didn't really mean that. That's usually our word of telling ourselves, oh, it's really, we don't have to do anything about this, I'm sure he didn't really mean that. I'm sure that he won't say anything like that again or won't do anything like that again, And so we start finding these ways to excuse to ourselves the need to really kind of pursue when something is wrong. And we wait until it becomes so obvious, so undeniable, that we have to do something, and a lot of times by then, what?
You got a big problem.
You got a much bigger problem. It's too late. It's that person has developed a following, and now you have the conflict that you didn't want to have. And it's much worse than what it would have been. Chris?
David, but that's good.
Sorry,
you're close.
Wow, okay.
No,
that was a biblical name.
Well, you got Christine, so I don't know. So it's okay. No, I just wanted to add to Steve's point too, is I think that comes also from a lack of education or confidence. Like if you're not studying the word and having that confidence to combat it, then it's easy just to become Play-Doh and mold with it. Those of us that are confident in what we do daily or what we know, you're not afraid to argue with somebody or combat them.
So one of the vulnerabilities that has been played on historically is a lack of scriptural knowledge. And of course, one of the big vulnerabilities historically was that the Bible was written in a language that a lot of people didn't understand. And for a long time, the Catholic Church controlled that by making sure that, the Bible is still, at most, it's translated into Latin, and nobody speaks Latin. And so we can make sure our followers don't read it. You can tell them anything you want to is in the scriptures if they can't read it for themselves. And so it's easy when you can control the actual language. Now nobody can do that anymore. But you can lull people into not doing their own reading, or you can take advantage of the fact that a lot of people don't do their own study, And again, if somebody knows that's a vulnerability, there are ways to play that up to make it an even bigger vulnerability. Did I see Sarah? Yeah.
Also, the thought process that a billion Chinamen can't be wrong, right? So as somebody is standing up, saying things, and you're like, maybe, but no one else is saying anything, right? It's like, well, maybe I interpreted that wrong. And what Frank is learning here is that as he calls to get his uniform, right? Yeah, he's speaking the part and saying the part, but clearly that secretary, receptionist, is going to believe him because other people have already backed him to be a pilot. He gets a uniform because he already comes with the backing of Pan Am. And so sometimes we do that because our perspective is everyone else is back and I don't need to do that. I don't need to go through the security checks with that. And that's also a very dangerous part with not knowing your scriptures.
So this is the danger of assumed authority. okay? We see somebody else, and we see that others seem to have given them authority, and because of that, we assume that they must be deserving of that authority, that they've already been vetted, to use a term kind of like what you were talking about. As somebody else has already done the work on that. And so when somebody says something or does something that doesn't seem quite right, our assumption is, I must have it wrong, because other people seem to have said that they're right, seem to have said that they've got the right ideas. So I must be wrong. And so rather than being confident in what we believe that we know, we kind of assume that it's going to be okay. Or we assume that it's something that, I've got a different view, but that's okay, and so no big deal, And there are definitely places for that. There are definitely places where it is okay to say, okay, you see it one way and I see it a different way, and that's okay. One of my favorite examples of this is the story of the rich man and Lazarus. There are some people who believe that's an actual true event that Jesus is talking about. There are others who believe it's a parable. I happen to fall into the latter category, but if you believe it's a real story, I don't think that really changes anything, because the core message of the story is still the same. You got to get make your decisions in this life. There are consequences for what we do. You need to treat others with respect and care. And once you die, you can't go back and fix it. All of those things are true, whether that story is a real story or whether that's a parable. And so it really doesn't matter whether we believe that one thing or the other. On the other hand, there are places where fundamental doctrines can be imperiled by someone having a different view of it. That was one of the Gnostic problems. The Gnostic idea was that Jesus didn't come in the flesh at all, or he came in the flesh for a while, and then he became spirit after a certain point prior to actually being crucified. Because they believed, at a more fundamental level, that flesh, matter, was evil, and that spirit was good. And there are all kinds of doctrinal heresies that come out of that because of what they believe. Well, at the most basic level, that's the kind of thing that you can say, there's something wrong with this, and it's not okay for you to believe that all matter is evil and all spirit is good. It's not okay for you to believe that at some point Jesus wasn't really physically here during his incarnation on earth. And that's why both John and, who else does it? John especially, though, highlights the fact that Jesus was physically here on earth, because if you don't believe that, it messes you up. And it messes up on a fundamental level what you believe about the Spirit, and it starts to create all sorts of heresies and flaws and everything else. So we have to be able to be recognizing that there are some places where it's okay if everybody has different opinions. And there are some places where it isn't. Steve?
Well, I was going to say that sometimes we really lose our focus on what the whole construct is about. And the whole idea is that God has provided us a pathway to salvation in Christ and his blood and his sacrifice, resurrection. And that's why we're here, that's why we live. And then we start looking at details after that. How do we get there? What does that look like? What's the meaning of that? And we keep filtering that down all the way. And then we start getting into the ideas of opinions, or, was the creation really 7 days, or was it, 7 million years, or whatever, and we can get into those, and then we find ourselves mired in that muddy mess down there at the bottom when we've lost the whole idea of why we're here and what we're doing.
Okay, so that's another system vulnerability, is the tendency to argue about sort of the ticky-tack stuff, where it's one opinion or another, and to lose sight of some of the bigger picture things. And that means if somebody can come in and make some good arguments about the ticky-tack stuff that kind of bleed back into those bigger things, that can start to distort our philosophies or start to distort our faith in certain ways. So, and beyond that though, it's also, by the way, you want to isolate the strong from the weak. One of the easiest ways to do that is by focusing on those ticky-tack things that the weak have a particular opinion about and the strong are more dubious about it. All of a sudden it becomes us versus them. And now the majority of the people are following you because you say what they want you to say, and they don't want to listen to the people, the stronger ones and the more stable Christians. And I can think of specific examples of this happening in churches where someone comes in and is very effective at basically, I say, well, who's going to be a problem for me if I want to kind of run things? It's going to be them, and it's going to be them, and it's going to be them, and how do I make sure that nobody listens to them anymore?
Precisely.
And that is and you can see this isn't just a church thing, this is a human thing. You can see this something with Hitler. That was one of Hitler's big talents, was isolating the strong people, pulling away their support, and then being able to do whatever he wanted to do. So you can see this with people who are very effective at taking systems over. And not necessarily by doing something illegal or doing something outside of the rules or the system, it's using the system against itself. And so we have to be very careful about this. One thing that nobody's mentioned, but I think is worth pointing out, is one of our biggest vulnerabilities in the church is that most of us tend to view other Christians from the standpoint of, we're going to assume the best. We're going to think the best of them. And again, there's nothing wrong with that necessarily until it starts to get in the way of our ability to say, okay, wait a minute, what they just said is not what's right. I need to do something about that. But if we want to think the best and we want to assume the best, and we welcome each other into our homes, we tell each other about things that we don't tell anybody else about, we develop special kinds of relationships with our fellow Christians, and we're supposed to do that, but somebody who knows that fact can take advantage of that if we're not careful. And I don't necessarily have a solution to all these things. My point is not to say, okay, we have to stop being nice to each other. That we can fix a lot of these problems of which none of us trust anybody else, and we're just mean all the time. We say whatever comes into our mind as soon as it happens. We could do all that stuff, and we would cease to be a functioning church very, very quickly. But just because there aren't necessarily any immediate simple answers doesn't mean that the problem doesn't still need to be addressed, and that we don't still need to be mindful of that. And so one of the jobs, for example, of an eldership is to pay attention for false teaching in a way that the average member of the church might not be able to, both because they have authority and because, at least presumably, they have a superior degree, or maybe superior is not, a strong amount of biblical knowledge and understanding and those kinds of things. So we have people whose role is to do that in most churches. Now, this church, we don't have an eldership. We do have some men who I'm pretty confident have a good foundation in the scriptures and who would be able to check the kinds of stuff that we're talking about here if they saw it happening.
And women.
And women, yeah, that's true too. In some cases, even more true in some churches. So, Karen, you had something you were going to say.
Ironic way.
I think you raised your hand, Karen.
One thing a term that I've learned to just detest is, well, I don't think he meant to say it that way. So my opinion is, if you're a teacher, if you're an elder, if you're a deacon, if you're a preacher, you're in a role where you should be able to say what you mean, and we should not have to guess.
Yeah.
And if something doesn't seem right, don't shove it off. Go and say, I don't understand where you're at on this. I don't understand what you're saying. And sometimes they say it and they don't realize that they're not coming across the way they should, that it's being misinterpreted. So that helps that person, the teacher, the elder, the deacon, the preacher, helps them to understand that, okay, I need to word this a little different next time, or go back and correct it with the class, or whatever. But to say, oh, I think he really meant to say this. I don't do that anymore. We did that once, never again. Never again.
Yeah, I think, and see, that's an example of kind of putting together a number of different things, the authority thing and different things like that, but especially the one where it's that, we want to see it through the lens of what we want to see, what Sarah had mentioned earlier. So we look at what somebody says and we say, well, he can't possibly have meant that. But it's much more likely he meant this, because this would be an acceptable variation or version of that for me, and so that's what I want to have heard. And so we do sometimes allow ourselves to believe the best when that's not what should be there. And you're right, I think it's fascinating the degree to which we give so much deference to people who should know how to express themselves. Preachers and public speakers, politicians. I mean, politicians have speeches written for them. If they didn't mean to say that, somebody along the line should have said, hey, well, you know what, you probably shouldn't say it like that, since that's not what we mean, But we, not all politicians, I mean, obviously it's kind of the highest level ones where they have people writing the speeches. Most of the rest of them are stuck with just doing it themselves, but, or maybe they get their wives to help, I don't know. So it's, I know in my parents' case, my mom was always more keen, excuse me, more cognizant of I shouldn't say was, they're still alive. They're just on a cruise at the moment, so anyway. So my mom has always been more aware of the things that people say and more cynical, maybe a little more guarded about what they might be intending than my dad is. And so a lot of the time, my parents would go to, I can remember growing up, we would go to worship and we'd be driving home and mom would say, what do you think he meant when he said this? And my dad would say, well, I think this, and my mom would say, I don't think that's what he meant. She telling what she thought. And the disturbing thing is more often than not she was right. Because she was perceptive in that way, and she did see more of that. And so we're not all necessarily really good at that, although I think we can train ourselves to be better. We don't have to sort of stop where we are and go, oh, this is as good as I'm going to get. We have to keep trying to get better and better at that. But public speakers are trained or experienced. Now, a preacher who just got started, there's a pretty good bet he's going to say some stuff he didn't mean to say the way he meant to say it, or in some cases, maybe some stuff he hadn't really thought all the way through, and if he had, he would have realized he shouldn't have said it at all. And so it's definitely true that we recognize that experience and training and those kinds of things factor into how well somebody expresses themselves. But, when I was in court, when an attorney got up and said something, there was nothing accidental about what they said. Everything that they did was designed to further the cause that they were taking. And in some ways, even things like doing things that made the other attorney mad was intentional. Why would you want to intentionally make somebody else mad?
Make mistakes.
You get them flustered, you make mistakes, they say things they didn't want to say. There's all kinds of things like that you can do with words if you know how to do it. You can affect the way people, without even them realizing a lot of times. But attorneys don't make not the ones who work in court. Now there's a lot of attorneys who don't ever go to court, and that's a different thing. But the ones who do go to court, they know what they're doing. They figured it out, or they've been trained how to do it. I have not had any formal training in preaching, but my training as an attorney has taught me how to speak pretty clearly and say what I mean. That doesn't mean I always convey things exactly the way I want to, and every once in a while, you'll have noticed by now, I'll say something and immediately go back and say, oh, that's not what I meant, Because usually I can hear it when it comes out. Oh wait, that's not at all. So we have some of that, but people do know what they're saying. And so while I think we want to give people a certain amount of grace, we also need to recognize, especially when somebody says the same thing several different times in several different ways, that's not an accident. That's on purpose. That's what they really believe, or that's what they really want to say. And therefore, we need to judge what they're saying and what they believe based on what they're saying they believe. And we ought not to just dismiss that because there's a more comfortable interpretation that we would prefer to use that would make it so that we don't have a responsibility to do something about that. Now, does that necessarily mean that every single person in the congregation is going to feel comfortable confronting the preacher about something that they said that seems wildly or significantly wrong? No. And I don't think that we should expect that. I don't think it's reasonable to expect that. What should you do, though, if somebody says something from the pulpit? I say something from the pulpit that seems wrong to you, and you're not comfortable coming and confronting me about that, and I can understand why. It's hard to argue with a lawyer. It's not, Sue can testify to that even more than any of the rest of you can. It's hard to argue with a lawyer. So what would you do if you're not comfortable trying to come and talk to me directly?
Gossip, of course.
Gossip. Exactly. No, not that. Other than that, what more scriptural approach might you take?
Lean on the brothers or the sisters.
Okay. So find yourself someone who is comfortable, and number one, who's going to be able to understand what you're saying. And this is a place where if you've got somebody who you trust in terms of their judgment, in terms of their conduct, you can go to them and say, hey, I heard this coming out. This doesn't seem right to me. Now, maybe they're going to come back and say, well, if you look at these here, actually this makes sense. And then you go, okay, that's cool, all right, it's all good. But maybe they're going to say, you know, I hadn't really thought about that, or you know, that's a good point. Let's go, or I will go talk to the minister, something like that. So that it's not simply ignored just because you're not comfortable being the one to take the lead on that.
Well, if you ever get to the point where you feel like you're set in your walk and you know everything that you need to know, you're not there, right? So even the lawyer preacher can learn something, and the congregation can learn something. And I think that it's important to realize that we can show godly love and affection to those around us without absolutely giving the farm away. And to protect ourselves in that regard.
Yes, absolutely, Steve.
And I think it's important that we're careful that we're just not looking for issues either. Because sometimes as a hearer, you can be wrong. You can hear it. And case in point, just the other night, I had to say a few words in front of a crowd up in Pine. Not church people, okay? And so it's more like a Roman Colosseum setting. And
release the lions!
I really try and make a point of being as eloquent, accurate about a description of something. And this one guy, the whole room got it perfectly right, and one guy got it just absolutely the opposite. I couldn't believe that he actually interpreted what I said the way he said. Now I was able to help him, and we talked later at length, and it was his interpretation of some terms that I was using that he didn't quite understand. And so we got it worked out. He understood later, but at first it was, he thought I was saying something absolutely the opposite of what I was saying. It was sort of surprising. I've encountered that many times.
And I think it's getting worse today because more and more we're getting these redefinitions of terms that make things, that help us to argue our position without necessarily really meaning what we think. The one that I've seen recently being used, it's been in the last 5 or 10 years, is you see this term grooming being used by conservatives. And I don't have a problem with doing something about people who are actually engaged in grooming, because it's a very, to be clear, we're not talking about, you know, getting ready for church by combing your hair, and you know, we're talking about the traditional accepted definition of grooming is a sexual predator who's using a variety of techniques to get a vulnerable person to ultimately buy into and enter into a sexually inappropriate relationship. That term has been co-opted by some really very conservative people, and they begin to use it in the context of trying to put forth a different view on sexuality in general. So they will accuse college professors of grooming because they're teaching about homosexuality. I'm not necessarily in favor of them doing that, but that's not grooming, not the way that term's been traditionally used. But if I were to use that term in a speech somewhere, some of my hearers would hear one thing and some of my hearers would hear a different thing, where 20 years ago, everyone would have heard the same thing. And so I think we're seeing more and more of that as people use certain terms and they co-opt them to mean something different than what's traditionally been accepted, but they're terms that get people's attention real quick. They're terms that get people upset real quick, and in politics and in speaking, if your first emotional reaction to what I say is something that I prize very highly, and it's going to affect the way that you view everything else after that, even if after you have that first reaction, you kind of back off a little bit and say, okay, wait a minute, it's still going to impact the way that you view things. And this brings me, I know we're running over time, so I want to bring out one last thing with ministers that can be particularly problematic. One of the things you have to realize is that you are almost always at a disadvantage to me when it comes to things that I'm preaching about on a given Sunday for one basic reason. And when I say me, I mean any minister. What is the main disadvantage that you have relative to any minister with respect to what they're preaching on a given Sunday?
You have to raise your hand.
No, well that, but you're coming to me afterwards, okay? But what's the core difference?
Whenever you're teaching or preaching anything, you've studied it
Exactly.
So
I
you
know what I'm going to say.
Right.
I know the material, and unless you happen to have some sort of real deep fascination with it, the chances that you know it as well as I do is very low. Now, that means that sometimes you have to do what Paul told, or what Paul complimented the Bereans for, which is what?
Study the scriptures.
Study the scriptures after they heard him. So he would say things and the Bereans would go look it up and then they would come back and say, yeah, that's right. Presumably, they would have also come back and said, no, that's not right, if they had found that that were the case. So one of the things, and this isn't fun because it's a lot easier to let me get up here and talk, you guys don't have to do anything, right? But the reality is that when I get up here and talk, you have to recognize that I have a huge advantage over you because I have been thinking about this stuff for at least a week, if not months, before I actually do it. And I have studied the things that support my view. And in general, I believe that I'm right. So I'm not getting up here just, not in general, always. I don't get up here and go, I think this is probably wrong, but I'm going to say it anyway. But the degree to which I believe is stronger or weaker in some situations where I know that there's some other interpretations. But because of that, you have to recognize that you're at a disadvantage and you have to not let that get in the way of your willingness to go check it out for yourselves and talk it through and think it through. Just because I have the advantage and you're not comfortable coming up to me immediately after a sermon doesn't mean that 2 or 3 weeks down the road you can't come back and do it. Which is the last vulnerability, which is the unfortunate realities is very difficult to undo the harm that somebody does in a public setting 2 or 3 weeks later. It's kind of like the same thing with the newspaper. The newspaper prints on the front page this big, here's this, terrible thing, and then like 3 weeks later they publish a retraction in a little column, 6 pages into the paper. And even if it's on the front page, a retraction still oftentimes doesn't have the same effect because that first idea that's gotten out there has already percolated through the consciousness. That's why people still think that Richard Jewell is the guy who set off the bomb at the Atlanta Olympics, even though he was clearly cleared in that. And it was, there's no question he was not the one who did it. And yet he is still, in many people's minds, he's still the Atlanta bomber because that was the first assumption, and that's where we are. So it's difficult to overcome these things. And again, the point isn't to say, okay, here's the solution. The point is to say, be mindful that we do have systemic vulnerabilities. God created the church, but he created it knowing that it would be people who were going to be the ones in it and making it happen. And because of that, as humans, we have vulnerabilities. And don't just assume that because the church is God's, everything's going to work out. Because remember, there are 7 letters to 7 churches in Revelation. Some of them are very complimentary, some of them are pretty negative, but the fascinating thing is that 200 years later, none of those churches existed. So they were churches, they were real churches, Jesus is speaking directly to them, and still they failed as individualized churches. The church universal will last forever, but the localized churches, not necessarily. And so we can't just assume that things are going to work out just because God is in our lives or something like that, okay? Not when it comes to the church itself. All right, that's it. Let's take a break.